Peter Urone in College Physics writes,
One of the most remarkable simplifications in physics is that only 4 distinct forces account for all known phenomena.
but can 4 unintelligent forces of physics alone really rearrange atoms into computers and airplanes and science texts? It is difficult to even imagine a more obvious and spectacular violation of the more general statements of the second law of thermodynamics, such as, for an isolated system, the direction of spontaneous change is from order to disorder. But we are all familiar with the standard counter-argument. The Earth is not an isolated system. It receives energy from the sun. Early versions of the second law stated that a quantity called thermal entropy, which measures disorder in the temperature distribution, cannot decrease in an isolated system, but can decrease in an open system, and some scientists generalize this to say that the second law allows any order increase in an open system as long as it is compensated by decreases outside the system. In a Smithsonian Magazine article, Isaac Asimov first acknowledges the apparent conflict between evolution and the second law.
You can argue, of course, that the phenomenon of life may be an exception. Life on Earth has steadily grown more complex, more versatile, more elaborate, more orderly over the billions of years of the planet's existence. From no life at all, living molecules were developed, then living cells, then living conglomerates of cells, worms, vertebrates, mammals, finally man. And in man is a 3-pound brain, which as far as we know is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe. How could the human brain develop out of the primeval slime? How could that vast increase in order, and therefore that vast decrease in entropy, have taken place?
But then he uses the usual compensation argument to conclude that there is really no conflict.
Remove the sun and the human brain would have not developed. In the billions of years that it took for the human brain to develop, the increase in entropy that took place in the sun was far greater, far greater than the decrease that is represented by the evolution required to develop the human brain.
Professor Granville Sewell of the University of Texas El Paso has published multiple peer-reviewed articles critiquing the compensation argument. Most recently, in 2017, he published an article in Physics Essays. There he defined X order to be the negative of the entropy associated with the distribution of any diffusing component X. If X is heat, for example, X order is just thermal order, and showed that the equations for entropy change not only say that X order cannot increase in an isolated system, they also say that in an open system, the X order cannot increase faster than it is imported through the boundary. Thus, he argued, the equations of entropy change do not support the illogical compensation idea. Instead, they illustrate the tautology that
if an increase in order is extremely improbable when a system is isolated, it is still extremely improbable when the system is open, unless something is entering which makes it not extremely improbable.
the fact that order can increase in an open system does not mean that computers can appear on a barren planet as long as the planet receives solar energy. Something must be entering the system which makes the appearance of computers not extremely improbable. For example, computers. The whole critique of Asimov's widely used compensation argument is very simple and can be understood through a couple of simple stories. Here is a picture of a neighborhood in Moore, Oklahoma, taken before the 2013 tornado hit. Here is a picture taken right after the tornado. Fortunately, another tornado hit Moore a few days later and turned all this rubble back into houses and cars, as seen in this picture. If we asked you why you don't believe our story about the second tornado, you might say this tornado seems to violate the more general statements of the second law of thermodynamics, such as, for an isolated system, the direction of spontaneous change is from order to disorder. But we could use the compensation argument to reply, Moore is not an isolated system because tornadoes receive their energy from the sun, and the increase in order in Moore caused by the second tornado is easily compensated by decreases outside the system. Various reasons why the development of civilization does not violate the second law have been given, but all of them can equally well be used to argue that the second tornado did not violate it either. Here is a certain Earth-like planet in a certain solar system as it looked about 4 billion years ago. Next is the same location about 10,000 years ago. At its prime, this large city had tall buildings full of intelligent beings, computers, TV sets, and cell phones. It had libraries full of science texts and novels, and airports with jet planes. Scientists explain how civilization developed on this once barren planet as follows. 3 or 4 billion years ago, a collection of atoms formed by pure chance that was able to duplicate itself. These complex collections of atoms were somehow able to preserve their complex structures and pass them on to their descendants, generation after generation. Over a long period of time, the accumulation of duplication errors resulted in more and more elaborate collections of atoms. And eventually, something called intelligence allowed some of these collections of atoms to design buildings and computers and airplanes and write encyclopedias and science texts. Sadly, there's a second story. A few years after these pictures were taken, this planet was hit by a massive solar flare from its sun, and all the intelligent beings died. Their bodies decayed, and their cells decomposed into simple organic and inorganic compounds. Most of the buildings collapsed immediately into rubble. Those that didn't crumbled eventually. Most of the computers and TV sets inside were smashed into scrap metal. Even those that weren't gradually turned into piles of rust. Most of the books in the libraries burned up. The rest rotted over time. And you can see the final result many years later. This time, the second story is natural and believable. It is the first story that is much more difficult to believe. The second story shows what natural causes normally do. They destroy order. While every other natural process tends to turn order into disorder, Darwinists have always believed that natural selection is the one unintelligent process in the universe that can create spectacular order out of disorder. But despite all the claims about the creative powers of natural selection, it has never actually been observed to produce anything new and complex, only devolution. Lehigh University biochemist Michael Behe, in his 2019 book Darwin Devolves, writes,
Darwinian evolution proceeds mainly by damaging or breaking genes, which counterintuitively sometimes helps survival. In other words, the mechanism is powerfully devolutionary. It promotes the rapid loss of genetic information. Laboratory experiments, field research, and theoretical studies all forcefully indicate that, as a result, random mutation and natural selection make evolution self-limiting. Darwin's mechanism works chiefly by squandering genetic information for short-term gain.
So perhaps natural selection of random mutations is like every other unintelligent cause in the universe after all, and tends to create disorder out of order, and not vice versa. Anyone who claims to have a scientific explanation for how unintelligent agents might be able to turn rubble into houses and cars would be expected to produce some very powerful evidence if they want their theory to be taken seriously. The burden of proof should be equally heavy on those who claim to have scientific explanation for how a few unintelligent forces of physics alone could rearrange the basic particles of physics into computers and encyclopedias and Apple iPhones. And there is no evidence that natural selection of random mutations can explain anything other than very minor adaptations.